There are several critical issues for today's forum. And one of them is that this, as I mentioned earlier, is part of the approach of NCID, bridging scholarship with policy-relevant innovation and interventions, first of all. Secondly, the major themes in the evolving national debate about the SAT, ACT type assessments and merit in higher education is extremely one of the critical issues which would be discussed by several of the panels today, and also evolving merit criteria and the implications of those evolving merit criteria for admissions, pipeline, retention, and diversity policy strategies. This is one of the handouts that you will have in your folder and kind of represents one of the approaches that we take graphically. On the left-hand side, the maze, it turned out to look more like green, but the maze side represents scholarship and the importance of bridging scholarship with intervention and practice and evidence-based practice. On the other hand, it's also important to look at social change projects and exemplary interventions and use them as basis in the reverse order to kind of promote scholarship. One of the major, if one looks at the major themes in evolving debates about SAT type assessments in merit in higher education, one of the things that is noted in chapter 1 of this book is that it seems to have evolved through kind of three major periods. Very early in the early 1920s, for example, when ETS first started, much of the debate about the SAT and merit was about looking at the SAT as kind of an analog for IQ. Then I think the literature suggests strongly that from 1959 to present, it shifted with people looking at the SAT versus the ACT as different but very similar representations of merit. And then in the 1970s, during the civil rights era and the unrest of the 60s and the 70s, there was a lot of opposition against big tests, the ACT and SAT. I think much of that opposition has settled, and what you have starting up in the 90s to the present is a convergence of views that it is necessary to certainly include and look at and utilize in strategic ways big tests and SAT, ACT type assessments as indicators of merit, but within a holistic and comprehensive kind of approach. Evolving criteria of merit in this kind of comprehensive approach with implications for admissions, pipeline, retention, policy strategies, end up including, if one looks at the literature, at least three categories of factors. One, what might be called academic merit. And of course, this is not only something that is used in holistic review in admissions, but people who are involved in pipeline interventions and retention work, as well as in broader kind of policy debates around diversity, look at the SAT, ACT as really a critical, but only one indicator of academic merit, along with class rank, grade point average, and course rigor or curricular tracks. And there's increasing need in the work at ACT, at ETS, as well as several university-based scholars have begun to also look at the importance of considering motivation and academic motivation of students in holistic review, as well as targets for intervention, both pipeline and retention, but also career motivation and specialized career-related talents. And then finally, the kind of educational goals and the resilience or the distance traveled or the degree to which students without adequate opportunity somehow overcome barriers that are certainly looked at as really critical motivational merit constructs. And then last but not least, there is emerging consensus that character and engagement merits need to be systematically assessed and systematically included in holistic or comprehensive intervention strategies. And they include things like character, service, leadership, and diversity. One of the interesting comments about the latter one, that is that there is some consensus about these other constructs. There's great debate about what it means to consider diversity as an indicator of merit. As people know, much of the litigation, including the upcoming Supreme Court case and the ongoing litigation around Proposal 2 here in the state of Michigan, really has to do with reducing diversity to looking at race and gender preferences. in some ways less controversial, has been a view where diversity includes a consideration of class differences and variety, as well as diverse viewpoints. Much less controversial and much more embraced as a part of programming, whether it be admissions, whether it be pipeline, whether it be retention, or whether it be other diversity initiatives. And there's a growing emphasis on the importance of considering diversity and inequality, or variety, not only in terms of strengths and viewpoints, but also in terms of differences in opportunity, and the implications of those differences, not only for the mobility of individuals, but for the multiple achievement gaps facing the nation as a whole, and the importance for the nation to address these, not only in the benefit of democracy or equal opportunity for those who have less privilege, but to really make the nation itself much more globally competitive. Today's forum and the logistics for it, and I would like you to look at the forum program, and we'll use it as a kind of a basis to give a slight overview for today's activities, and also to look at the speakers and panelists and logistics, including the first panel that we have here. And we'll have two this morning, as the program indicates. We'll have a very exceptional luncheon presentation by Mark Neve from the Association of American Medical Colleges, which I think certainly represents exemplary practice, not only around issues of holistic review in admissions, but also the kind of diversity strategies that they advocate and work in collaboration with medical schools across the nation on. And I think, as I was sharing with some of the other participants from engineering and other places, I think we really need much more cross-fertilization across these different schools and colleges and domains. And then finally, we'll have at 3:45 breakout sessions for participants to get engaged more formally around issues of admissions, pipeline, retention, et cetera. And in some ways, therefore, today's gathering is designed to deepen the national debate on the concept of merit in higher education access, success, and diversity. Through presentations from the national experts, as well as breakout sessions and our own local experts, we will explore ways to promote a more inclusive American meritocracy through comprehensive pipeline, retention, achievement gap, and diversity strategies, to which in some ways much of the kind of work at places like ETS and ACT becomes a really critical criteria and critical priority for them at this stage in American history. Indeed, as we move further into the 21st century, we continue to find ourselves in the midst of a pivotal kind of historical moment, a time when we have an unprecedented opportunity and a responsibility to explore ways by which all promising students in the U.S. can pursue and succeed in higher education within a more inclusive American meritocracy. The opening panel, who I think, is everyone here?
Yes.
I think we need one more member. And while she's coming, let me introduce our first panel, titled Diversity, Merit, and Opportunity, Challenges in the 21st Century. At this point, John Young will lead off this panel conversation with a presentation based on his recent chapter in this associated volume on the impact of anti-affirmative action policies in higher education. Dr. Young is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and director of the University of California's Equity in Education Policy, and usages of educational evaluation, including patterns of school segregation, the effects of school context on educational outcomes, the importance of integrating evaluation into everyday school practice, and the evaluation counter-educative impacts of high-stakes testing. His work has been featured in many prominent journals and used in multiple briefs, including Gratz and Grutter cases. as well as in several school desegregation cases argued before the Supreme Court case. His talk will be followed by remarks from three panelists: Angela Locks, who returns to Michigan after several years away at Long Beach State or Cal State Long Beach, and we welcome her back. Will present from also her chapter on diversity, merit, and college choice. She is an assistant professor of student development in higher education at Cal State Long Beach, with a PhD, of course, from the University of Michigan, the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education, and has an interest in kind of institutional praxis and recruitment, retention, and experiences of students of color in colleges and universities. Her time at Michigan included work with the Undergraduate Research Opportunity Program and the National Center for Institutional Diversity. Next, we have Ed St. John, who's an Aldo Collegiate Professor of Higher Education at U of M, Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education. He is also concerned with education for a just society, and interest that stems from 3 decades of research on educational policy. He serves on a series of co-edited readings on equal education, where he co-edits that with myself, and also on several other publications, including core issues in higher education. He also directs the initiative promoting equity in urban and higher education, funded by the Ford Foundation, as a faculty associate at NCID. He will present from his chapter on critical analysis of merit assumptions in higher education, with a particular emphasis on ethical and moral questions, I think, that are, and philosophical questions that are too often left out of the debate. Liliana Garces is the final panelist, a postdoctoral fellow in the National Poverty Center here at Michigan, directed by Sheldon Danziger, and assistant professor in education at George Washington University. Her work bridges law and social science research to inform policies that may assist educators address SES, or socioeconomic status, racial and ethnic inequities across K-12 and post-secondary education. Prior to pursuing her doctorate in education at Harvard, she worked as a public interest attorney in the areas of immigrants and low-income women's rights. She will further clarify changing social political environment around diversity, merit, and opportunity issues, reporting on the ongoing Fisher and Cantrell cases. As time permits, following this discussion, we'll also have an opportunity for questions from our speakers. Please welcome the first panel.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I first have to ask your indulgence for any professorial moments that happen while I'm up here. It's a little early for me on the East Coast, so I might have some lapses, but hopefully it'll all get pulled together. And of course, by professorial moments, I mean those lapses and not getting up here and digressing about things, which I guess I'm kind of doing right now, but that's kind of the thing that I do, so hopefully be ready for that. I also want to apologize for the web folks and for people with bad eyesight back there. This is going to be relatively heavily graphics-based, so I'm going to do my best to point things out, and it's set up in such a way that the trend lines are hopefully very clear. So the great thing about going first is it's kind of a blessing and a curse in disguise, right? The one good thing is you're setting the tone for the first panel in the day. So that's kind of the curse part, I think. The blessing is you get to shape and decide how you want to present the, maybe hours worth of stuff that you have in a single article and compress it down to 15 or 20 minutes. So these are the choices that I made going forward to talk about. So the first is an introduction in general to ballot measures in court cases, but really embedded in that is a discussion about the importance of what the purpose of the research is. So this idea of not necessarily forgetting, or hopefully not forgetting, the overriding purpose and get lost in the methods and tactics. Because very often, if you're deeply involved in policy work, you're deeply involved in the legal work, deeply involved in the work of schools or universities, the interests of getting something heard often trump your vision of what you're trying to fight for. So the fight stops becoming about what you care about and starts becoming about how to get what you're doing heard. And there's a way to do both, but to not give up the former for the latter. So I want to talk a little bit about that as we go through that. The second is I want to look at some specific cases. So I want to look at UT Austin, the University of Michigan, and the University of Oklahoma. And Michigan is somewhat clear, I'm pandering a little bit, but there's a real reason for it as well. And it should become clear when I talk about the ballot measure pieces. And I think the last piece, this third piece, is relatively important. It's this discussion of race as a factor and the causes of the variation in the data that we're seeing. So what we care about isn't just a uniform story, right? Uniform stories are nice in some ways, but incredibly boring in others. What we have here is a richness of outcomes. And the question is, what is that richness of outcomes? And what can we get and gain from that? And then, what can you do moving forward, which is always something that I like to talk about. So what we're talking about is essentially a two-front crisis when it comes to diversity and meritocracy in education. One of them is political and policy-based. So this is the question of referenda. So there are numbers of referenda that have happened around the country in the last 5 to 10 years that really are about banning the use of race, period, across all state and local policies or practices. So as of 2010, 10 states, and this is from about 95 to 2010, about 10 states had ballot measures banning affirmative action. So Arizona, California, Michigan, Nebraska, and Washington passed measures that ban the use of race. Colorado, Missouri, and Oklahoma failed to pass measures. Oklahoma failed to pass it actually at the ballot. Colorado and Missouri failed to get it on the ballot. Oklahoma and Utah have it on the ballot in 2012. So Oklahoma is a repeat offender, as it were, in this case. The thing about these referenda is the legal arguments, which I think definitely Liliana is going to go over later, are very constrained, the kinds of things that you can say. Policy arguments are wide open, right? So in some ways, we need research that speaks to all of those pieces. We can't just have research that talks to the legal cases. We can't just have research that talks to the constituents that we're talking about. And our constituents are varied. So we're not just talking about the voters. We're not just talking about the legislators. We're also talking about administrators and faculty in our institutions of higher education. And there's a role for research on each one of those pieces. I think it would be the height of irony if, in fact, people who do diversity research end up doing the same research, right? And in fact, I don't think there's any danger of that, but there is, I think, a danger of wanting to read the data only in one way, right? Or to look at the data in one way. For every way that looks bad in some ways, there are potential benefits if you open the frame a little bit wider, right? There are always opportunities. As Dr. Bowman suggested, there's a way to attack this on multiple fronts, and I think that's the key as we go forward. Oh, by the way, there's another category here, which are executive orders. There's only one state that sticks out, and that's Florida. Florida was an executive order passed by Jeb Bush, which banned affirmative action. But the interesting thing about it is it didn't ban affirmative action in the blanket way that these referenda do. So while these referenda banned affirmative action or the use of race in anything, the executive order really only banned it in admissions. So the University of Florida system has, if they choose to exercise that right, the ability to use race in other aspects of their processes. So it could be used in terms of scholarships, it could be used in terms of recruitment. It's banned from these referenda to use it even in those ways. The second, of course, is the legal front. And I think we were all, at least I was, feeling pretty good about myself after Grotz-Grutter. It wasn't a complete victory, but it wasn't a complete loss, and I think it was more than most people had, well, some of the more pessimistic folks among us might have thought. But Fisher v. University of Texas and Cantrell versus Granholm have kind of popped up. And the thing about these two cases, I think, is the Cantrell versus Granholm is related a lot to these referenda, and the Fisher versus University of Texas is essentially a direct attack on Gratz versus Grutter, or Gratz and Grutter. And again, I think Liliana's going to talk more about this. So not only do we have to worry about the technical legal issues and the kinds of things that constitute evidence in court, but we have to talk about the evidence that constitutes changing hearts and minds. And those are two different kinds of arguments and two different kinds of evidence. So what kind of evidence do I have to present to you? Well, I'm taking a 35,000-foot view, right? So I'm in a jet plane flying over these places. What's the kind of quick and dirty context that I can provide for you? And what's the story from it? So this is kind of the graphics-based thing I was talking about. This is the University of Texas at Austin. I focused on first-time degree-seeking undergraduates from 1994 to 2005. Some of you will say 2005 is 6 years ago or 7 years ago. Why exactly are you stopping there? Well, that was actually where the paper stopped. But I added some years in a subsequent slide so I could talk about that. So the vertical lines, the first vertical line talks about when Hopwood actually passed there, so you could use no affirmative action in Texas. The second line talks about Gratz and Grutter overturning Hopwood, and the third line there, vertical line, talks about the resumption of affirmative action at UT Austin. Now, during this no affirmative action in Texas and all the way through the current line, Texas actually has a 10% plan in place. For those of you that aren't sure what the 10% plan is, it's basically a plan that allows all students who score in the top 10% of their high school senior class, and that's by class rank, it's not by the TOS test, are eligible for admission, actually in fact guaranteed admission, to the flagship universities in Texas. So what happened during this no affirmative action piece through the Hopwood is they had this 10% plan. Now, after Gratz and Grutter opinions, when Hopwood was overturned, they were in this odd period where they could use affirmative action, but they were still using the percent plan primarily, and then they decided that they weren't actually getting the outcomes that they wanted, and they decided to actually resume an affirmative action plan in the state of Texas in 2005. So let's take a quick look. The top line are white students, and this is the share of enrollment, first-time degree-seeking freshmen. And the second line are Asian Pacific Islander students. The third are Latino. They're listed as Hispanic because that's how they list them in iPads. And the fourth line, the solid, the square lines, are black students, and the race unknown is the bottom. And the race unknown almost has no salience here in Texas, but it matters a lot in Michigan, and we'll talk about that. So the bottom line here is a comparison. So we can look at the trends, right? The trend is that white shares are falling, and Latino shares are increasing. And that's an important thing to actually see and note. The question is, what does that mean relative to everything else that's happening? Well, the question of comparison group is always a critical one. If you actually compare this to high school graduates, you will see this dropping much more steeply. And what you end up seeing is an increasing gap over time. What I chose to compare it to were total 2- and 4-year enrollment, higher education enrollment in Texas. This includes all institutions, community colleges as well as public and private institutions. And the reason that I made that choice is because you could argue that these are flagship institutions. Not all people who graduate are actually even have an interest in going to any of the flagship institutions. So the question is, what's the appropriate comparison pool? And this is the one that I chose. This leaves lots of room for other people to make different choices. And I think it's critical that people make different choices so we have a sense of what this actually looks like across the broad spectrum of what we're talking about. But if you do look at just high school graduates, it's actually growing quite a bit, which suggests a growing gap that access is actually decreasing. They're becoming consistently more overrepresented. Here, we're not seeing a consistent increase in any sort of overrepresentation, but we're seeing the exact same overrepresentation over essentially 15 to 20 years, right? Even with the percent plan, even with affirmative action. If you look at Latino students, this is the total 2- and 4-year enrollment in Texas. You see enrollment steadily increasing. The bottom line is UT Austin enrollment, share of enrollment. The top line is 2 and 4 year enrollment in Texas. It goes from about 21% up to about 25% for Latino students overall. At the University of Texas at Austin, it goes from about 15% up to about 17%. So you see a slightly increasing gap, but increases across the board. So in some sense, you could argue that the University of Texas is actually trying to do something, but it's still not keeping pace. And this speaks to really an important piece here. The same representation, depending on demographics, is often losing ground, right? Particularly in states where the demographics are changing very fast. The story for African American students is not quite as good. You can see, for instance, when affirmative action actually got banned in Texas, that there was a drop. And the thing is, the enrollment levels are so low that even small drops matter as a percentage, right? So we're talking about a drop of 1% when you have 5% enrollment is 20% loss, right? You're talking about a 20% loss in the enrollment of African American students in the institution. So you see there, which was actually more than a 20% loss, the first year that affirmative action was banned in Texas. There was a slight increase in the middle during the percent plan pieces, but then that fell back to the levels of 1997. And part of that has to do with some of the incentives that are set up around the percent plan. What's the incentive? Well, the incentive is if you are a white student or a high achieving student in a district that is very high achieving, to attend that district as long as possible, and then in your junior or senior year, move to a bad school, right? And the bad schools are generally populated by Latinos and African American students. And what you end up seeing, actually, is nearly 25%, and this is a recent estimate by Long, of transfers in the later years of high school are from white students substituting into poorer school districts. So part of the reason that you're seeing some of the losses there through this 5% plan is around that issue. And you can see that there were some slight increases after Hopwood overturned Gratz-Grutter for African American students, and the trend is a very slight narrowing, but we still have a very substantial gap. The African Americans make up about 12.5%, 13% of the 2 and 4 year enrollment in Texas. These are students that want to go to higher education. In fact, enrolled and are attending in a degree-seeking program. And yet it's still at about 5 or 6% for the University of Texas at Austin. For Asian students, it's the exact opposite. What we see is UT Austin having a higher overrepresentation of Asian students versus their population in 2 and 4 year schools in Texas. So the enrollment for Asians is basically flat at around 5%. But at UT Austin, it started at about 15. At its peak in the middle of the Hopwood era, it got up to about 18%, and now it's at about 16 or 17%. So they're overrepresented by almost 3 times their population in the higher education world. So here, I've added a couple years, as you can see in the shaded area. UT Austin was able to resume affirmative action. Here's the interesting thing. They're resuming affirmative action over and above the 10% plan. The 10% plan makes up about 75% of all people enrolled at UT Austin, which means you're only playing with 25% of enrollment numbers if you want to do anything that includes race as a factor. And what you do see is you see Latino enrollment actually continuing to increase in the post-affirmative action era at a slope that's roughly the same or maybe a little bit higher than it was prior. You also see a continued trend in white share decreasing, and you see a slight increase in African American share. And again, as I said before, small increases in African American shares actually make a big difference when we're talking about a place with such low African American enrollment. However, it's clear that they've not benefited as much as you might like, meaning approaching close to proportionality related to their share in the higher ed pool as a whole. And proportionality is kind of a dirty word when you're talking about legal world, but when you're talking about the real world, proportionality is important, right? So this is one of those things that you have to actually talk about as a difference. So the University of Michigan. What we have here, again, the same chart and graph, white students, Asian Pacific Islanders, black students, race unknown, and Latino students. There's only one line. Prop 2 actually passed in 2006, which was past the scope of what we did. You see, though, when the Gratz-Grutter opinion required a change to the undergraduate admissions policies, you see a small trend that's kind of kicking up a little bit from 2003 to 2005. What does that actually look like versus a 2- and 4-year enrollment in Michigan? You see that the University of Michigan is actually underrepresented in terms of white students. That underrepresentation is really a function of the admissions process in Michigan, right? It's a commitment to diversity when it comes to these things. So the funny thing is overrepresentation looks like discrimination. Underrepresentation of whites is a commitment to diversity. It's all how you frame it. But what you will see is a narrowing of that underrepresentation as time goes on. For African American students, you see a very large increase, in fact, in overrepresentation from 2003 on, which is not really good news. In 1994, you see exact proportionality. So you see a really big difference occurring in the University of Michigan over time. For Latino students, there just really aren't enough to really talk about here without there's no kind of scale to this, so I'm going to kind of skip to Asian Pacific Islanders again. Asian Pacific Islanders vastly overrepresented. We're talking about 3% in the population as a whole and about 12% at the University of Michigan, relatively flat over these years. Well, what happened after Proposal 2 passed? The top line is the proportion of white students enrolled. You see a pretty steep run-up since Proposal 2 passed. In 2006. Really, 2007 wasn't the first year that it got implemented for various legal challenges and other reasons. 2008 is actually the first year that it was, I think, in full force, and you see a steady increase there. For Asians, you actually see a relatively, I don't know, prominent tick up. For African American students, you see a trend down. In the 3 years prior to Prop 206 being passed, so 2004 through 2006, averaged against 2007 and 2009, there was a 1% drop in the percentage of black students, which constitutes, again, a 20% drop in African American enrollment. What isn't listed here is the race unknown. So that tick up looks terrible, and it's not great. But what's interesting is that the race unknown actually dropped. The increase in whites was about 7.5 percentage points. The drop in race unknown was about 6 percentage points. So the question is what actually that race unknown category meant. I think you could actually make a decent argument that Prop 2 actually caused students to be more comfortable declaring their race. The question is whether they were all white students. Previous data suggests that it's not. But to be safe, you could argue that there's maybe a 1%, the lower limit is a 1.5 percentage point increase in the share of white students over and above redeclaration after Prop 2. So the change could be anywhere from maybe 1.5 to 3.5%. But you can see that there's a definite narrowing in terms of the overrepresentation at the University of Michigan. Oklahoma is fun. The reason I put in Oklahoma is this is a state that actually has a referendum pending. There are almost no minority students, but what you see is a crossing. So the University of Oklahoma, the total 2- and 4-year enrollment has whites going from about 75 to 70%, but the enrollment at Norman goes from 70 to 80%. So you actually see a cross in Oklahoma. So in some sense, affirmative action doesn't matter in Oklahoma. This is the crazy part of these referenda. In almost all the referenda states, affirmative action makes no difference. Why? Because their flagship university is non-selective. 85% of people that apply in Oklahoma get in. So it's not a question of weeding people out. It's a question of who you're keeping out at places like the University of Oklahoma. And yet these are the places where these proposals, these referenda are gaining the most steam. So the real question is, what do we need to convince all people in all of these stakeholder places that diversity and meritocracy, the way we're thinking about merit, is probably not the right way to go? So the question becomes not what's happening at these individual institutions, although that's important, and it plays into this. It's why is there so much variation? Variation is evidence of the effectiveness, in my opinion, of university autonomy. So the idea that universities, institutions, states have a decision point about what to do internally when issues of legal decisions and legal opinions come down, as well as when referenda are passed. How do you deal with it internally in your institution? And the different ways that they've done it depends radically on the local context and on the commitment of the local actors into changing what they want to actually end up changing. An example of how important diversity of those kinds of pieces is and how endemic it is to the culture. I said good morning a few good mornings back. Whenever I'm in Texas and talking and I say good morning, there's like a flood of good mornings and I almost fall over backwards. Literally, everyone says good morning in chorus. Now that's a minor thing, but what it really suggests is huge differences in culture. And culture makes a difference in messaging and in how that message is going to be received. There's a policy framework that talks about subsystems, right? Subsystems have to be working overtime and all the time on particular issues. Why do they have to be working all the time and overtime? It's because these subsystems actually provide a basis for moving forward when opportunities present themselves. When policy windows open, when opportunities happen, you have to have something ready to push into that window, be it research, be it an argument of a policy, be it anything. And without that kind of readiness, opportunities will pass people by. So what can people do? We're talking about recruitment. You can use alumni networks, outreach to minority schools in some places. These are alternative means for creating diversity. Some institutions are stepping up to do these things. Alumni-based and focused scholarship. Holistic review of applications emphasizing non-cognitive factors that are academic, social, and personal merit. So these things that are not necessarily about their test scores. The more you shift that, the less you constrain yourself as an institution. And then, of course, percent plans. The irony of which is they rely on segregation at the K to 12 level to function and succeed. So the more segregated your K-12 schools are, the better off you are as a higher institution using the percent plans. That's not exactly the perverse kind of benefit you want to get, but it's just the fact of life. In a place like Texas where segregation is extremely high, it can actually have some sort of effect. So in general, the conclusion I want to make is these battles here are here to stay and will move to places not seeing large proportions of minority students, which means the messaging, if you want to actually do that and make policy difference, matters. The struggle is becoming how to maintain, not increase diversity. And the maintenance can be a losing battle depending on state demographic changes. The results of court cases could radically change the landscape just as minority populations are increasing and making it more critical to address these issues. And of course, regardless of the court rulings, autonomy cuts both ways. Court only allowed universities to use race, right? The court allows you to use race. It doesn't force you to use race. So this idea is, once you win that battle, that doesn't mean anyone's going to use it. So somehow, we have to figure out how you move and how we move institutions, organizations, and people to see diversity as an important consideration of what they're doing. And that's it. I just want to acknowledge, of course, my co-authors, Michelle Moses and Patricia Marin, and I want to thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Good morning. It is good to be back in Ann Arbor. By the time I left for Cal State Long Beach several years ago, I had spent literally half of my life in Ann Arbor. So it is good to be back to visit. I first want to thank Phil Bowman for having us today, and thank you, John, for your opening comments. What I'll talk about today is diversity, merit, and college choice, and this comes from a chapter in the volume that Phil Bowman has referenced, and the first author is actually Rana Natour, and then along with myself and Phil Bowman. And Rana was actually a UROP student when she became the genesis for this project and this book chapter. Because of increasing global and national demand, college admissions at elite universities in the U.S. have become ferociously competitive as the debates over affirmative action and diversity continue to evolve in the 21st century. For example, the admissions cycle in the 2008-2009 academic year was one of the most selective in modern memory at U.S. elite schools. And in 2009-2010, the record-setting admissions rate was even lower. In the context of national debates over affirmative action, the declining number of underrepresented students of color at our elite flagships reflect two major trends. First, in contrast with a former era of strong affirmative action policies, fewer number of minority students are admitted with borderline SAT, ACT type test scores. Second, fewer highly qualified minority students with the most competitive SAT, ACT test scores choose to accept admission offers from these selective public institutions. Much has been written about the first issue, but we still know very little about the college choice process that results in declining yield rates among highly talented minority students who are accepted into our elite flagship universities here in the U.S., especially those faced with strong scrutiny over their affirmative action practices. So one of the things that we did in beginning to craft this conceptual framework was to really look at Hostler, Braxton, and Coopersmith college choice model. And this is probably the seminal work on college choice in terms of taking a global perspective on it. And this part of the traditional literature points to a number of factors that go into a student's college choice process, including socioeconomic status, parental influences, peer influences, and institutional prestige. And Hostler, Braxton, and Coopersmith conceptualize college choice among a number of options that students have as a multi-stage process that results in making a decision to attend a particular institution. And economic models of these college choice models have been the major focus in the higher education literature, with an emphasis on costs as a major factor as students choose where to attend college. Cost is important, and the cost of attending an elite flagship university has grown over time, as we all know, and in some cases, not all, outpace inflation. Moreover, when a financial crisis affects endowment levels, revenue streams, and certainly students' personal pocketbooks and family situations, it also takes a toll on need-based aid programs. And if the trends continue to persist, the pool of students who qualify for Pell Grants is going to undoubtedly increase. And changes with Pell Grants, as we're all aware, really do affect our students of color disproportionately because of disparities with wealth. And so this financial climate has a direct effect on students' college choice processes. The college choice literature also reveals that the other factors that students take into account are their pre-college experiences, a number of individual factors, a range of institutional characteristics, including their appraisal of campus life. And the challenges of sorting through this information exacerbate how students of color in particular choose where to go to school. And there are a growing number of studies that show the college choice process specifically for Latina and Latino and African American students differs from their white counterparts. But we still know very little about how affirmative action policy and the socio-political climate for affirmative action affects these students. So this is kind of our conceptualization of how affirmative action policy might be shaping how students are thinking about college choice. And as illustrated in this figure, the literature that we reviewed suggests that a series of federal policy rulings have intensified the socio-political climate for affirmative action, the conflicts and associated debates, and then also the recruitment challenges for elite flagship universities. Since the 1964 Civil Rights Act, affirmative action policies really were designed to reverse historical policies of exclusion. Overall, these policies provided greater access, making enrollment in elite institutions a possibility in unique ways, and also addressing persistent inequities in K-12 settings. However, since '78, the Bakke ruling, anti-affirmative action movement has kind of escalated, which John has outlined, Liliana will discuss later. So what we really tried to do here was try and capture the environment that students are navigating as they choose their college choice process. So you can see the federal policies that are outlined, and really we thought that the socio-political climate plus the declining socioeconomic conditions, which predated the crash of a few years ago, really led to ballot initiatives. And then what's also affecting students' college choice process is this merit-based belief system, notions and definitions of reverse discrimination, which lead to affirmative action backlash. But that there's also hope, and that students do still aspire to go to college, and that is particularly so for African American families and students. That has been a persistent trend for many years. And over the last 5 to 7 years, the trends for Latina and Latino students and their families and their aspirations about college going have increased. So with the context of elite flagship institutions, Competitiveness, notions of proportional equality, campus affirmative action policies really do affect our recruitment and admissions practices, acceptance and retention, all toward meeting our goal as higher education practitioners and scholars of having diverse student bodies. So the take-home points from our literature review are that affirmative action policy does affect the college choice process of African American students and Latinas and Latinos. The students are not naive about the climate that we live in the United States, and they're very much aware of the political dynamic and how that's connected to their college choice process. And again, a poor socio-political climate for affirmative action limits the access of students of color to elite institutions. Further, the college choice process, we need to better understand specifically how the socio-political climate affects how students are looking at where do I go to college and where's the best place for me and where will I be at home. And so we contend that a new set of factors need to be incorporated into the college choice process, particularly for African American and Latina and Latino students. So in the book chapter, we suggest a modified college choice model for students of color because of the unique factors here listed on the slide. The literature, again, has been heavily guided by econometric models, status attainment models, and multi-stage choice models. And the multi-stage choice literature has found, again, that pre-college experience, individual factors, and institutional characteristics affect the college choice process for students. However, there's much more complexity for African American and Latino students. This figure here reformulates the Hostler et al. Model that I referenced earlier and considers how the anti-affirmative action debate and related socio-political climate may interact with pre-college individual and institutional factors that impact how students choose where to attend college or university. And in recent years, a number of scholars have called for a specific focus on race and ethnicity to try and explain the patterns that we see with how students choose to go to college. African American and Latino students are not always necessarily motivated by the same things as their Caucasian counterparts. So here you see we have the traditional pre-college educational environments and experiences in terms of academic support services, the rigorous curriculum and pipeline programs. But these factors are really specific to African American and Latino students. The individual factors, they will look familiar if you're familiar with college choice models. And family wealth and not income is actually more important to the African American and Latino students because of wealth disparities in the country. So you can have very high income African American and Latino families that don't necessarily have the same wealth base to draw on in terms of financing a college education. And financial aid, loan aversion is particularly important to these groups of students, as well as the amount of aid offered. And then the financial aid process is also affected by the proximity family. That is something that these particular two groups of students take into account. And we argue that one of the ways the socio-political climate for affirmative action impacts these students is that students are looking at our institutions, particularly our elite public flagships, to see what are we saying publicly about affirmative action, what are we saying about admissions. And this is an area where, as admissions professionals, recruitment and outreach professionals, it's very important to have a coherent message for your campus, as John mentioned, and also to stay on message. Because the messages that we have internally on our campus, how that gets translated in the communities we're doing outreach and recruitment in, sometimes gets misconstrued and not to our benefit in terms of recruiting a diverse set of students. As suggested in this table, future research also should consider 4 types of a diversity fit typology, if you will. Personal, institutional diversity fit appraisals, if you will. Avoidance, attraction, curiosity, and indifference. Such studies could be designed to investigate how these 4 types of typologies between students' perceived fit and personal and institutional diversity commitments, how that affects their college choice process. So for example, under the institutional avoidance condition, highly qualified students of color with competitive SAT, ACT type test scores and strong personal diversity commitment might decline offers from universities perceived to have low institutional diversity commitment in response to affirmative action challenges and related socio-political debates. In addition, the general social psychological evidence on the importance of person-environment fit, there's also a growing literature in higher education that supports the importance of diversity-related personal and institutional appraisals in the college choice process, as well as an appraisal of the campus climate. So some policy implications. To remember that at least until these other court cases are heard, the Supreme Court affirmed the use of outreach programs in 2003. And then as ballot initiatives continue to evolve, that we not disconnect those balloted initiatives from students that are coming from immigrant backgrounds being targeted by these initiatives, because they're not disconnected. And then they're also to always acknowledge and process and think about what it means for our own individual campuses to negotiate the tensions between a merit-based belief system that's really grounded in competition and this U.S. American ideal of a democratic belief system that's grounded in equality and equity. So some recommendations for both policy and practice. In terms of policy, federal, regional, and state-sponsored comprehensive programs that address cultural, social, and financial preparation for adjustment to college and college going need to broaden their access to higher education for students as well as communities, including parents, typically excluded from higher education. And in terms of practice, higher education practitioners, we need adequate institutional resources to properly acknowledge the nuanced college choice process, particularly of African American and Latina and Latino students. And that becomes a real challenge in today's budget environment. And then we also need to, all along with both the federal and state programs as well as our own institutional programs, validate the ethnic identity and the realities associated with being a person of color and a student of color in the United States through institutionalizing our outreach and campus programs. Thank you.
I want to start by giving three thank yous. One is to William Sedlicek. Part of today's conference is really about broadening the conversation, and Bill Sedlicek has really been a pioneer in what is thought of and called non-cognitive variables. And he has, over time, kind of intuitively and practically come up with a way of thinking about a broader framework for admissions, and in a sense given us a number of proofs through engagement and action experiments that show it works. Now, that's one important kind of additional note, you might say. The second is I want to thank Phil Bowman. I mean, like said, he's been a friend I've worked with for a long time. And if you read this book, you will see that Phil has brought the non-cognitive variables into a social psychological theory base that gives us a way of thinking about building on student strengths and a strength-based approach to admissions and retention that gives us a way through a number of these problems. And so I think that not only is the NCID providing some visibility into exemplary methods, Phil's adding a kind of a theoretical base to this work that I think is important in moving the conversation forward. My comments in my chapter really have to do with kind of what you might call a theoretical, philosophical, and moral sense-making out of all of this. And I'm engaged in this work after prior decades of work that focus in different ways on inequality and remedies to it. I got started in the 70s in research on Title III of the Higher Ed Act, which worked with historically black colleges, and that was the period of the desegregation of higher education in 1977, and so I was really looking at institutional development and the reformulation of historically black colleges during the period when that was important. From there in the 80s through the 80s and 90s, I concentrated a great deal on student aid and the issues that Angela was speaking to with respect to the role student aid has played in creating a new set of inequalities since the 70s. And really the last decade, inclusive of my work here, I've been really increasingly kind of concerned in terms of the moral responsibility we have in the field of higher education for having made a bunch of claims about academic preparation that led to a redesign of high school diplomas. And that has engaged me very much not only in thinking about admissions and retention with the academic element, but also thinking about the alignment between high schools and colleges in ways that make sense out of the changes we've just been through. So when I kind of talk about theories of justice and the issues related to human capabilities and social critical issues these days, you might say in this decade, I do so with this kind of past experience and recognition that the theories we started with were situated in the Great Society, the efforts to desegregate. John Rawls' theory of justice kind of gave us a framework for thinking about that, but we're in a new global period that's different. So I want to speak a bit about kind of what I derive from Rawls and then go into what is different about the period we're in before I get into talking a bit about admissions processes and their consequences for retention. Now, Rawls basically speaks about three sorts of principles. He highlights two, but there's a third there. So one is kind of the basic rights and liberties, and I think there's no doubt now in terms of the literature in the global period and so forth that there's a basic right to education, particularly an education to a level that allows a person to support their family. I'm going to come back to that, but there's and what that standard is changing, and so that's a very important issue as we think about this context. The second is what's generally referred to as the difference principle, and that is that if there's a prior disadvantage, especially a disadvantage attributable to our public systems, then we have to somehow correct for that as we move ahead in the system. We can't assume that those prior inequalities didn't exist. And that's where we get into a number of the kind of complicated tactics, you might say, for admissions. But the third thing is he talks about a just savings principle and had two elements to it. One is that it related to taxation, and the second was it related to our commitment to cross-generational uplift. This is the biggest issue of change, you might say, from the Great Society period to the present. We aren't as committed as a society to taxing for cross-generation uplift. Rather, we have moved to a society that requires kind of a pay and borrow strategy for going to higher education, which is very complicated. And so we have to craft our policies within kind of some understanding of that. But it runs deeper, and so this is why a critical understanding of what we're encountering in higher education is very important. And I think kind of critical theory and human capabilities are very important in that. So I just want to talk about two things from kind of my understanding of those literatures. One is this shift in the graduation standard, raising high school to a college preparatory standard, fundamentally changes our moral obligation at Michigan and other institutions with respect to admissions. In the old days, we had a preparatory track and we could select within that track. In California, it's moved to A to G for all, and we moved to our new standards here in the state. We, in a sense, have to recognize the prior inequality differently. Now, that's what the Texas 10% was all about, right? And so we're grappling for ways to deal with the new context of inequality created by this new generation of neoliberalism. But the second issue is very, very interesting to ponder, and that is how it is that the basic standard relates to these prior inequalities as we kind of deal with the human fairness in the workplace. Now, in this society, we've essentially framed the uplift of high schools in terms of global competitiveness. Similar things that are going on in China and elsewhere, and we really, in a sense, now have two thresholds to think about education. One is the basic education, which has become college preparatory to at least, if not some technical, but also the equal opportunity to have access to advanced education related to professional opportunity. And so we've shifted the obligation of high schools into preparing people in a different way. So our College of Engineering has engaged in a white paper that really takes a fundamental critical look at high school preparation in the state of Michigan. And it's aligned with policies in Michigan. So this brings me to kind of an issue of what kind of standards can we have to look at and think about admissions and so forth. So one is we need common criteria. It's clear that from the courts and all the litigation and the initiatives and so forth, people want to be treated in some sense in ways they think are fair. And so we need criteria that are applied to everybody. We have a window of time, we don't know how long it is, to consider race. We also have opportunities to rethink what we consider. And I think that the 10% plans and different ways of thinking about merit embedded in that are very important. In some of my work, I've not only thought about class rank, but I've done some tests to show that we can re-index the ACT, the SAT, or state merit exams, and use those in admissions and get the same effect. We get diversity that represents the population of a state. Why do we do that? We do that because we still have a segregated society. Now in Texas, we learn that white people are going to Hispanic high schools. You know, long ago, Michael Olivas told us, well, if that's the outcome, that's a good thing. You know, so in some sense, we are in a churning society, and we can't deal with our own kind of moral obligations as a society as we think about college. So the common criteria is an important piece. But let's not forget this issue of fairness related to the prior inequalities created by what we now know are unequal high schools. Let's deal with those issues fairly and justly as we deal with the admissions and academic support of students who arrive on campuses. And I think that requires us to not only consider the possibility of non-cognitive variables, but also the 10% and the merit adjustments and so forth, and to communicate about those with counselors in high schools in ways that let them know their students will be treated fairly. Now, there's also a commitment that we have that's this fiduciary responsibility to uplift. And we can't ignore the fact that we are sitting in institutions that have raised their academic standards. When I was a high school student, they didn't have calculus in my high school. Now, if you don't have calculus or more, you have a hard time in certain STEM fields at a place like Michigan. And so we have some obligation, A, to be fair to those adjustments that are going on in high schools in relation to the kind of academic environment we have, particularly in STEM fields. And so we have an obligation to think about admissions and support in ways that are important. So I applaud the work going on here in terms of STEM academies and so forth. Now this brings me to a question, which is how do we apply these standards of fairness, that I'll call it the common, the fairness, and the kind of fiduciary obligation of uplift in relation to generic types of admissions. And I kind of laid the groundwork for that in some of the things I just said, but one generic type is standardized tests. And we have many experiments using standardized tests only. A second is things related to class ranks and readjusting standardized tests so that you do the rankings based on schools or other contexts. And the third is non-cognitive variables. Now, each of them have some advantages and disadvantages with respect to our criteria. I have 5 minutes. And the class rank issues bring us back to where we were before standardized tests. But there's a shift in terms of the class content required for graduation, which was a major factor in going to the standardized tests in the first place. So whether we're using standardized tests or grades or some combination, we have an obligation to think about these contexts. I think that it's also important to know that the non-cognitive variables that are widely adapted, they're adapted here. Ted Spencer will talk about the holistic method, which includes things like leadership and so forth, which are related to non-cognitive variables. The fact is that SED's lists aren't what people use exactly. They've evolved and morphed as people come up with common ways to talk about admissions. So I think that by balanced approaches, I think we have to rethink the issues of common approaches, fairness, and the moral obligatory obligation of support people who come in as it relates to the inequalities in prior preparation. That is to say, we do have an obligation to essentially give a contract to a student that says, if you do X, Y, and Z, you're going to have a fair and equal opportunity to complete our institution. So I'll conclude with just some kind of guidance for reform. I think that a common system is very important, and it's important to think through the limitations of the methods we use, including limitations of holistic methods that are balanced and so forth. In other words, the reiteration of these methods is very important. And second, I'd say the fairness issues are very important as we think these things through. I think that the moral obligation of public institutions in this post Great Society or global period are different than those of private institutions. I think that public institutions of all type have an obligation to realign with high schools. And it's not just academic realignment, it's also in terms of the socio-cultural aspects of the broad social transformation we're in the midst of. And based on that, I think that these concepts of fairness have issues for deans and these distributed budgeting systems and faculties as they try to kind of deeply embed fairness into the ways they do instruction and academic support and so forth. And with that, my time is probably up.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. For my time this morning, I'm going to just provide a very quick general overview of the legal challenges that we have right now with respect to affirmative action related policies, and just some thoughts about the future of affirmative action policies. Now, many of you are already familiar with the Grutter v. Bollinger decision, which upheld the constitutionality of affirmative action, that is the consideration of race, as one of a number of factors in admissions decisions. And the court held that institutions had a compelling interest to pursue the educational benefits of diversity, and that the ways in which the University of Michigan Law Schools was conducting their policies in a holistic, individualized review met that second prong of the analysis, that was, those were means that were narrowly tailored and therefore constitutional. Now, since Grutter, we've had two types of challenges that are playing out in the courts. And the first is ongoing challenges to affirmative action practices. That's the Fisher case that our panelists have referred to. And that's currently before the US Supreme Court. And the second one involves challenges to bans on affirmative action, including Prop 2 here in Michigan. And that's the Cantrell case that has also been mentioned. Both cases involve challenges to these laws under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution. But the legal arguments are very different, and I'll provide just a quick overview of those two types of arguments. Now, starting with Fisher, and John has already done a very beautiful job at setting that up for me. This is a challenge to the University of Texas at Austin's admissions policies, as revised after the Grutter decision. As John has already outlined, before Grutter, UT Austin was banned from considering race based on a Fifth Circuit court decision, Hopwood versus University of Texas, that had held that the practice itself was unconstitutional. So this was a 1996 decision. In response to this, Texas adopted the Top 10% plan. And this was intended to help universities increase minority enrollment. And the plan has been in place starting 1997, and it's with a combination of outreach and financial aid, has helped UT Austin maintain some racial diversity in its student body. Now, when the US Supreme Court decision issued its decision in Grutter in 2003, UT Austin considered reintroducing race in its admissions policies. They did this after conducting a couple of studies, and they focused in particular on racial diversity at the classroom level in small classes from about 5 students to 25 students, with the idea being that these were the kinds of spaces that would allow for the most robust exchange of ideas. And what they found was that African American students and Latino students remained underrepresented in these classes. And in a different study also found that minority students were reported feeling very isolated in the classes and in the campus. So based on these findings, the institution decided to reintroduce the consideration of race as one of a number of factors. And that's the current policy that's being challenged, a combination of the top 10% plan with this Grutter-like policy. And in 2008, you had 2 white students who had been denied admission to UT Austin. They sued the university on the grounds that this revised policy was unconstitutional. They argued basically that the top 10% plan was sufficient to address the university's interests in diversity. Now, under Grutter, if you have other kind of race-neutral ways that can further your interest, the consideration of race would be unconstitutional. UT Austin is defending the revised policy on the grounds that the plan itself has been insufficient to provide the critical mass that's necessary for students to obtain the full educational benefits of diversity. And at the lower courts, the district court agreed with UT Austin, Fifth Circuit affirmed, and the US Supreme Court just last month granted certiorari. And the briefing is currently being completed. Oral argument will be scheduled sometime during the fall term of the court, which begins in October. And we'll have a decision sometime then as well. Now, Justice Kagan recused herself from deliberating in this case. She could not vote on the cert petition. She will not be able to participate in the deliberations. So given the current makeup of the court, it's likely to either be a 4-4 decision, which would leave the Fifth Circuit decision standing, or a 5-3. And to the extent that there's any kind of swing vote, it was probably Justice Kennedy, though it's important to consider that Justice Kennedy dissented in the Grutter case on the grounds that the policy itself was not narrowly tailored. So he agreed that there was a compelling interest, but was suspect of the ways in which this concept of critical mass might lead to a quota type of measure that would be not narrowly tailored in his view. And given the conservative makeup of the court, there's also the concern that the compelling interest that was endorsed in Grutter might be cut back. So assuming that we're able to still defend this compelling interest that institutions have to further educational benefits of diversity, the issue then becomes about the means that you can use to further that interest. And depending on what Justice Kennedy decides, those means can be very restricted. Now, combined with policies that ban affirmative action, what really starts to emerge is a socio-political context where, in order to further the educational benefits of diversity, institutions are having to adopt race-neutral policies, which on their own may not necessarily be race-neutral. After all, the success of the top 10% plan, as has been mentioned, depends on racial segregation of high schools. And it's also intended to increase minority representation. So race neutral may be a misnomer, but nevertheless, that plan itself is not being challenged. And in the legal world, we live with a lot of fictions, and it is not considered a race-conscious plan. So this other context where institutions are having to adopt race-neutral policies to further educational interest and diversity includes states like Michigan, where affirmative action has been banned. And this brings me to the second case, the Control case, which is the challenge to Prop 2. And as I mentioned, this is a challenge under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And it relies on a long line of Supreme Court precedent that has interpreted the Equal Protection Clause to ensure a fair political process. And by fair, I mean not having the majority manipulate the channels of change in a way that makes it more difficult for racial minorities to advance their interests. And this is under what's called a political doctrine standard. So here the argument is not that you should allow affirmative action, but that the law, Prop 2, is unconstitutional because it changed the political process in a way that was not race neutral. And here the process that was changed was that before Prop 2, individuals could lobby the respective governing board of each institution to adopt or not adopt specific admissions policies. These were lobbying efforts that before resulted in Michigan adopting affirmative action that then led to the challenges in Grutter. But now, after Prop 2, individuals can still lobby the respective governing board to adopt or not adopt particular admissions policies unless those policies are race-based. And then, if you want to do that, first you have to repeal the amendment. You have to amend Michigan's constitution. So, in essence, the argument is that the law made it more difficult for minorities to advance these race-based admissions policies while leaving prior, less cumbersome avenues available for individuals who seek to advance any other non-race-based policies. And that in itself is unconstitutional because the majority is changing the process in a non-race neutral manner, which makes it unfair. So that's just a recap of the argument in this case. It was just recently, on March 7th, argued before the en banc court of the Sixth Circuit, and it might be a while before we see a decision. Now, as this challenge is pending here, including the University of Michigan, there's been modifications to the two policies to comply with the ban on affirmative action. Now, let's say that the law ends up being reversed as unconstitutional. The question then becomes whether these race-neutral policies that are being adopted might prevent institutions from then adopting race-explicit policies like affirmative action based on their success, as we're seeing potentially in the Fisher case. So the more successful that institutions are in maintaining racial diversity through these race-neutral means, the harder it might be to defend race-explicit measures like affirmative action in the legal arena, not to mention the public arena as well. So that concludes my
or the question.
Yeah, Bill Sedlacek, University of Maryland, to get to hear what I say in a few minutes here. But I thought this was a good kickoff session and that these bigger thoughts from several of you are important. But as I see it, we're in kind of a repressive phase in the society, sort of anti-women, anti-immigrant, anti-lots of things. So I'm interested from several of your panelists, if we had to do one thing from our end, from higher ed here, what do you think we could spend our time best doing to sort of bump us back up in another positive direction? Several of you dealt with that theme, and I'm just wondering in a short bit of advice what you'd suggest for us.
Okay, any panelists choose to respond?
I guess I got elected to go first. I think Sed's raising the key question. What I've tried to say in my remarks is that we need to hold mental frames that allow us to maneuver through this. It's as though in the practice and policy of admissions, we need to have a set of non-cognitive variables that allow us to move toward a fairer system. I think that the progression of moral reasoning over centuries is on the side of moving toward greater civility and fairness and rights of women and diverse peoples. And we do have regressive forces. So we have them in this country. Last night I was speaking to the Baha'i students about a film that on Access Denied that they had in Iran. And you know, there's no doubt that fundamentalism is a regressive force for other parts of the world. Neoliberalism has had a regressive element to it. And so those of us that believe in the social good have to reconstruct. So, like, one of the terms that I'm going to use in a talk to students at Nebraska soon is that the tuition loans is like tax and borrow, pushing the obligation from taxpayers to students to pay the tax and to borrow both. So we've constructed these odd policies in the name of oddly constructed notions of rights. And so I think we need to have a new kind of navigational skill that relates to social justice.
My framework answer to that is really a discussion around whether or not you think that, especially public education, is actually a public or a private good. I think this idea that that Ed was raising around the borrow and pay issue is really the idea that you own your own education, and the purpose of your education is for your own personal betterment. But the real purpose and idea behind public education was really elevating society as a whole. And getting back to the mission of what public institutions are supposed to do, I think could turn and fundamentally be a standing point to kind of address some of those non-cognitive pieces that I think is really critical. So raising the idea that really education isn't just about you getting what you want, but you actually contributing to society in a way that works to the betterment of everyone. And I think that actually could form a framework to guide people towards policies that are a little bit different than those that they are pushing towards now so strongly.
I would say that as for institutions, it becomes quite important as well to create the kind of environment that is really exposing students to the social inequities, that we develop an understanding of the historical context of inequities in our country, and to not really allow for us to continue to be crowded by kind of colorblind perspectives in our society, which is really where we're going, and to continue this educational mission to have a full education for students to really understand the complex ways in which race affects us all individually and as a society.
I'll just add that I think institutions, particularly higher ed institutions, need to invest more in college access programs that begin in elementary school and in middle school. College access programs that focus on 11th and 12th grade years really are not sufficient to really change who gets to go to college in the United States. And I'll also add, for those of us that are involved in teacher preparation programs, we have to ensure that each of our graduates of our teacher preparation programs graduates with the belief that each of their students that they'll encounter is a learner and is a potential college graduate. And I think those two things could really change who gets to go to college.
Hi, I'm Kriska Bierwart, and I'm Associate Director and Multicultural Coordinator at the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching at the University of Michigan. And thank you, Phil, for this great start, and the panel members. I just wanted to comment, it's been nice to hear as some of the discussion progresses, kind of more commentary on the institutional culture and the practices. Angela, your remark just now about what the students experience while in college, I think is a crucial element to this discussion when we think about policy, recruitment, legal issues. The question of what are students coming to college for, what is this diversity mix for, I think could be more present in the statements of the university leadership. generally. And I think that it's something, that's really upon us all to think about ways of reconciling what we know to be important with what Ed just mentioned, repressive kinds of factors. I mean, we can talk about the issue of critical mass. Who is the critical mass for? Is it for the minority students? Many of those of us who are in minority positions in institutions realize a lot of our presence has to do to provide white people with the opportunity to learn diverse perspectives. The idea of the importance of training in diversity contexts for the global workforce, that's a huge benefit that cuts across the board. And, the strategies in terms of policy seem to me to articulate goals in a fairly narrow sense. We're developing more of a sense of mission, or shared language about mission, I think could be really valuable. The point that aligns with this is the importance of having students experience once they get to college, especially at a flagship institution, be a healthy one, because of course we know that student success here can really affect our pipeline as well and might be our best recruitment mechanism. So I wanted to add that comment. I know you're talking about achievement gaps and things later in the afternoon, but I really wanted to underline some of the points that were already made by the panelists this morning. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kriska. Nick, I know had a question, had a comment or a question.
Hello, this is Nick Collins. I'm here at the University of Michigan, and my question is for John Yun, and it concerns one of your slides for the state of Texas. What I think I saw represented there was a slide showing total enrollment by ethnic groups. And what I think I saw was a declining white population, an ascending Hispanic population, an ascending Asian population, and a somewhat declining, you might even say steady state, but we know it's declining, black population. And this seems to me to parallel the demographic trends for the state of Texas over the last couple of decades. And so I'm wondering your comment or reaction to the extent to which you believe or think it might be demographics driving those changes as much as either affirmative action policies or anti-affirmative action policies.
Well, I would argue that we should look at those things and look at proportionality and say, on some measure, in some sense, Texas is doing what it can to address demographic shifts. What happens in schools isn't necessarily going to be automatically driven by demographic shifts. And what I mean by that is you can look at different institutions where the demographics move, but the enrollment in the institution stays exactly the same. The University of Oklahoma is an example of that. What you would hope to see is that the institution be somewhat reflective of the demographic changes that are going on. So on that measure, you could argue that UT Austin has actually done a pretty good job. And I would actually agree with the fact that the 10% plan and the work that they're doing internally has been able to keep pace with some of the demographic changes. But if you look, I would argue for looking at the system more holistically, as Ed was arguing for before, and look at the K-12 system in relation to that. So I think the other piece that I didn't show is the idea of what's happening to the high school population. So while the college population is growing somewhat mildly in terms of the minority students and decreasing somewhat mildly in terms of the white students, the K-12 population and the number of graduates is actually increasing much more strongly in terms of Latinos and decreasing much more quickly in terms of whites. So depending on how you compare and what you compare the University of Texas to, it's doing very well compared to the college population as a whole. It's doing pretty poorly compared to the high school population, which suggests the necessity of looking at the system more holistically and asking the question, what's happening in the K through 12 system that's actually driving this issue? There's so many complexities you can't really get into 20 minutes, but that would be my answer to that.